and its impact upon war. We begin to see the emergence of the railroad telegraph, foot-fire artillery, machine guns, repeating rifles, barbed wire entrenching. It's all coming out in the 19th century, latter half of the 19th century. So what do we see in terms of trend? Emphasis toward mass firepower and large armies supported by rail logistics. They had it, so they dump all this firepower in there and use that as a basis for decision. Increased emphasis on a holding defense and flanking for wide turning maneuvers. In other words, hold back and sneak in the back door. But still not at the tactical level, the use of these frontal assaults, large stereotype formations, trying to blow their way through. And the results not too surprising. You tend to suppress ambiguity, depth, and mobility. You suppress this, you suppress surprise, what do you get then? Bloodbath. These are kind of ingredients you need in order to generate surprise. So let's tie a few of these things together. Let's couple that. The idea of modern technology, or the rise of 19th century technology, that's the ideas of Napoleon, Clausewitz, and John. Tie that together and you see what happens here. These things tend to feed upon one another. In other words, I'm repeating these words. You tend to suppress ambiguity, deception, and mobility, particularly down to tactical level. Therefore, you're unable to generate that surprise. And it was done in all these wars. Civil War all the way down through World War I. So in that sense, technology down to tactical is being used as a crude club trying to beat your adversary over the head. Now, if you look, like in the Civil War, people like to criticize Grant very heavily. His Vicksburg maneuver was very, real neat strategic maneuver. And he, in conjunction with Sherman, laid on a nice strategic maneuver when he was actually holding, he was playing the chain, holding Lee up north, so Sherman could go crashing through the south. The strategic maneuver, cut the south again in half. But tactically, it was tied to the middle, up the middle, and blowing people away, both sides. Didn't make any difference whether it was a long war or short war. See, so Grant's been criticized, but primarily the tactical level. But he was no different than other people. They're all doing it. That's my point then. Evolution of tactics did not keep pace with the increased weapons lethality developed and produced by that 19th century technology. So it raised a rather interesting question. Why were the 19th century and early 20th century commanders unable to evolve better tactics to cope with those ingredients that technology produced? Where's that lethality as well? They didn't. We're going to pretend right now we're still back in the 19th century. We can't answer that question. We're going to answer it. We're back in the 19th century. We don't know the answer either right now. I want to show you some more events where people did cope with it, how they did. Just finally answered, but didn't get answered until the latter part of World War I. We'll bring that up. Right now, I'm going to let the question stand. We will address it. But I want to bring that to your attention. Okay, with that in mind, there's another thing that showed up in the 19th century. After this, we'll take our break. So we not only have 19th century technology, but 19th century technology also brought about something we call like Marxism. In other words, the impact of 19th century capitalism on, today we call insurrection and revolution. And this is with a Marxian flavor. Remember, I just put on a Marxian hat. I'm a dirty son of a bitch. I'm on the other side. You got to look at the other guy's culture from his viewpoint. That's why I call it with a Marxian flavor. We're going to look at it from their viewpoint and see what we can pull out. I'll let you read it and I'll comment on it. We all became Marxists when we read it. Now, notice a couple things. What we begin to see now is not conflict between social systems, but conflict within a social system. Modern little worker, leading up. Keep that in mind. Also, we see these things, we start talking about things like crises and vanguard. You see it very often in their literature, the idea of a crisis and vanguard. Yet we see in our depiction of modern guerrilla warfare, they don't even bring that out. I said, read there, they're the ones that are doing it. We'll see it from their viewpoint. Might get an insight. Note that we're talking about crises and vanguards, we'll underline that. So it raises a rather interesting question. How should such an unpleasant situation be corrected? We'll look at it once again, we'll keep our Marxian hat on. Looking at their viewpoint. And after you read this, I'll comment on both these charts. Note what I depict, necessary conditions for success, both the crises and vanguard. You get the crisis, that allows you to build up the vanguard. The vanguard then can exacerbate the crisis builds up in more vanguard, now you got an incestuous feedback loop, you pull the whole thing apart. So look at that. Crises then represent the height of confusion disorder and the idea of generating a non-cooperative center of gravity in a guy's system. In other words, pumping up his internal friction, the inverse Clausewitzian notion. So they are periods of conflict weakness. Then the vanguard can exploit that, cause more instability, more crises, which feed the vanguard. So now you got the thing going where the whole thing comes unglued. You got it all. Oversimplified. And it's really interesting when you read the Russian documents or you read the Marxian flavor in a modern sense, how they bring out the ideas of vanguards, the crises, you know, they're talking about guerrilla warfare and all this stuff. Very important. So I'm trying to say, in a sense, they are the golden key for Midland to penetrate into the idea of insurrection, revolution, guerrilla warfare, insurgency, etc. But think about it. When you're really talking about crises, you're trying to disrupt or destroy those ties that make a society, generate those non-cooperative centers of gravity, and pump up that internal friction so they can't function as an organic whole. The inverse Clausewitzian notion. Okay? Now let's glue it all together. Up to this point. So we have here then, we look at capitalism, technology, and the conduct of war. Sort of a quick summary. In other words, start taking the society apart from within. How can we use these notions? In order to do that, we have to look at World War I, World War II, and their aftermath. We'll do that after. Back after lunch.
Every month, every month. No, I do that. I take the same when we try water. We're not getting for.
We probably got him the absolute part of the presentation already. Any question you might have had this morning, or you're still trying to muddle it over in your mind? Okay. Let's go on, because I already indicated earlier this morning, there is a hard down, I think one of them on Now, if you recall, I said we wanted to do one there, just look at World War I, and of course the aftermath, the preceding chart. So that's what we're going to do. You can lay it out actually in terms of three parts, what they call the plans and execution phase. You can organize it in this fashion, it's not unusual. And here I'm referring to the Schlieffen plan and the French plan 17. Okay, they were implemented, or the beginning of their implementation was in August 1914 here. They pretty much washed out by that October. And in its place came so-called trench warfare, the stagnation phase. And then, for lack of a better word, spring of 1918 and beyond, the finale of the final phase. So it's not an unusual breakout, so we'll look through it, through this breakout, this organization. We'll treat them in order, plan and execute, stagnation, phenology. So let's do that. Now, if we look at the Schlieffen plan, it's a good vehicle for observing that first part. Why, what I'm showing you here is a schematic of the way it actually unfolds, not necessarily the way we some of you people have read some military history and there's pros and cons, or we should have gone this way and that way. I don't want to get into that argument. But basically what we have here, we see 5 armies pivoting on next here. And the idea was to get in behind the Allied armies, put them in a bag, isolate them, of course, terminate the war. Naturally, that didn't work out. The chart also indicates. So what am I really trying to detect here? Basically, what I'm showing you is a large-scale single envelopment scheme. It's called a large-scale or gigantic single envelopment scheme. And we talked about ultralight. Now we're seeing a very vast, much vaster scale than we've seen it before. So that's all I want you to remember. Single envelopment, kind of a scheme there. You see that coming about. Also, obviously, you see in here, I normally don't bring it out, but it brings in the nature of unequal distribution of your forces in order to gain leverage. As a matter of fact, that's one of the criticisms why the plan failed. It didn't have sufficient unequal distribution of forces in order to make it work. In other words, initially they did, but then they started modifying the plan. Now, with that in mind, let's look a little deeper. The action and reaction unfold. What we see, these offenses, like that one, for example, were conducted on wide frontage. But however, they tended to emphasize few rather than many harmonious independent thrusts. In other words, these thrusts, like even showed in the previous chart, they all had to work in a lockstep with one another, work together. Where they tend to work together. Now, why did people tend to do that? Why did commanders want to do that? Because they were very much concerned about protecting their flanks. In other words, they didn't want to get a flank shot in them, so they wanted the units all working in the same pace, the same rate of move. But if you think about that, if everybody's going to operate at the same pace, then if anybody gets held up, that means all of them are held up. Not only that, if one operates at a slower pace, you're going to move the pace of the slowest unit. Isn't that a notion of predictability? Obviously. You become more predictable. And also gives your adversary longer time in order to sort himself out. The other point is, if everybody operates with the same character, you also become more predictable. Everybody's operating at the same pace. All your operations are going to appear alike. All the other ones. So you're not only slower, but you're more predictable. More evident, more obvious. If you see one aspect, pretty soon you can extrapolate and understand the rest of the aspect. So what happened? When somebody gets in trouble, or a unit gets in trouble since they want to free them up, they start feeding reserves. The other guy starts feeding reserves, you get both sides feeding reserves, now you got blood back. Somebody gets hung up, okay, pump in the reserve. The other guy didn't want, he pumps his reserve in, so now you get this huge blood bath taking place. I mean, it's strength smashing into strength. Basically what happens. Very simple. In the reaction to this, your defense is organized into what we call belts of fortified terrain, trench warfare. The key ingredient, artillery and machine guns. So if somebody comes on, you lay on the artillery fire. If they come in deeper, you pour in machine gun fire. So after many casualties are pinned down, then you throw in a counterattack and throw them out. It's done over and over again. Over and over again. And the result, not too surprising. Not too surprising. Example, Battle of Somme, 1916. Very small sector of the front. The British had a 1-week artillery preparation, pumped in 2 million rounds of artillery. Keep an area up for 1 week. On the 7th day, the British infantry went in. First day's casualties, 60,000. 1 day. 60,000 casualties. 1 day. That went on for, I think, 5 months, and lost over 500,000 troops. Okay, so they figured, well, that didn't work so good, we got to correct it. So in 1917, the other battle of the Trigger, Battle of Passchendaele, as the British like to call it, small sector. What they did is they had almost a 2-week artillery preparation, pumped in over 4 million rounds. British infantry went again, they failed once again. What they didn't realize, they tried to actually have a quantitative change to gain success. What they needed was a qualitative change. In other words, they had to do things differently, not just try to do the same way with more emphasis. So why would that fail? Well, think about it. A couple numbers. One, if you're laying a 1 week's artillery preparation, after a couple of days, your adversary is going to get wise that something's happening in that sector of the front. So he can transfer reserves behind the front. Two, because they've had earlier artillery preparations and they know the damage of artillery. What you do is you start dispersing your people in the front. Instead of line, you start dispersing throughout the front, also place them in bunkers to minimize the effects of artillery. And three, if you're going to be able to conduct one of those barrages, 2 million or 4 million, or large expenditures of ammunition, the only way you can do that very near the front, you have to build up huge artillery stockings or artillery zones. Well, that takes time. In the meantime, enemy recce and intelligence activity is going to notice that. So if you're building a certain sector today, hey, something's going to happen to you pretty soon. In other words, it's not. And then the tactics themselves they use. I just build up the middle. Very little tactics. And we begin to see that kind of happen. Okay? So now a way out. The rise of so-called infiltration tactics and guerrilla tactics. French captain by the name of Andre Lafarge in 1915 wrote a pamphlet as a way of trying to go through these fortifications, which is infiltration tactics. And the Germans captured the pamphlet, plus they were thinking in similar lines, so it acted as a catalyst, and so they started training a lot of troops. And of course, it washed over the West in the spring of 1980. Sometimes they're attributable to a General von OODA. And the reason why I have a question mark there is he was not an architect of that. He just had to be one of the commanders on the German side who did employ those tactics. At the macro level, attributable to Ludendorff, he did recognize the importance of it, so he did support the whole effort, and rightly so was deemed a macro level architect in that sense. And then another tactic is the guerrilla tactics seen through Lawrence of Arabia, or Peter O'Toole, if you saw the movie. 7 Pillars of Wisdom. You can read the book. In any case, we see he recognized the importance of that kind of thing, but there's even another guy who's probably more adept at it than even Lawrence. A guy by the name of Lechau Vorbeck, Prussian, down in Germany's Zeppelin. And with just a few officers and a couple thousand enlisted men and some Africans, he surrendered after Germany did during World War I. He fought off between 200 and 250,000 British troops. And he had 20 or 30 generals arrayed against an 8 million colonel. And they actually getting stronger toward the end. They had to convince him that Germany lost the war.
That in Europe was that in
Germany's Africa. Yeah. Down in Germany's Africa. And even in the British official accounts, they tend to give him more credit than Lawrence. Not that Lawrence wasn't successful as commander, but remember, Lawrence was being supplied by Allenby in the Middle East, whereas Lechau Vorbeck was virtually cut off and was literally living off the British themselves. So we see that kind of thing. Now what I want to do is we're going to look first at the infiltration tactics and guerrilla tactics and compare, which is we can do that kind of thing. So now let's look at the infiltration tactics. I'll let you read this, get sort of a feel for it, and I'll discuss it. This is the one chart snapshot. But the key point, I'll discuss it, some of you can go back to it. But the key point, instead of just trying to destroy people, you use it to disrupt or suppress the defense. That's one aspect, it can obscure the assault. So in that sense, you can think of the artillery as being a chain for the following effort of 2 teams. And look at the second row. These small teams, instead of these huge formations going through these small little squads. 10, 12, or 14 teams. There's little swarms, each one working its way independently forward. They're spaced out laterally and longitudinally. And what they're trying to do is find the gaps or weaknesses in front, trying to flow into it. And then behind them, small battle groups working in behind them, they go through and then try to cave in the local defense areas the Germans have there from the flank and the rear. And then even larger groups, reserves and stronger following echelons, go through those breaches, widen even more, always working flanks and rear, until finally you got little arc-lights called a torrent pouring through the front. But at every level, you're trying to work the guy's vulnerabilities and weaknesses. Now, if you read that, you begin to say, well, my God, that sounds like what Sun Tzu was saying about water going downhill. That's Sun Tzu tactic. But it took the World War I before they come up with Sun Tzu tactic. He wrote that back in somewhere between 300 and 500 BC, as people say. So we begin to see that kind of thing. And of course, the idea is quite simple. Eruption of many thrusts, not just one thrust. That gets blocked, the other ones don't go through. You're just trying to pour through. And the idea is to break through, envelop, and cause your adversary to cave in. Okay? So we see a different kind of setup. And it raises this point. They may create some vivid images in your mind, but what it really doesn't address or deal with, how the fire movement schemes work. How you use firepower with movement as a basis in order to gain leverage. So let's give you an insight into that. Here's the key thing. Fire at all levels. Artillery, mortars, machine guns. In other words, you'll have upper level, you have used artillery. Pasted down at the lowest level, you have mortars, machine guns, etc. In any case, the idea is to pin your adversary down. In other words, you're not going to stand up when some guy's spraying the area and artillery machine gun fire. You're going to get pinned down. Plus, together with gas and smoke, tends to obscure what's going on. Plus, thereby tends to cloak infiltrators' movement. The infiltrators, in the meantime, the way they're working their way more, instead of these nice, neat, huge formations, are slithering through these small little groupings, swarms, we call them. Are hard to see too. So you combine all that together to capture attention, the spirit, an indistinct character. They really deny your adversary an opportunity to picture what's taking place. You can't get a good image of what's going on. Well, remember, if you're not oriented, how do you make the perfect decision, take the perfect action? You can't. When you're talking about a guy getting a picture in his mind, you're talking about orientation. So you obscure things sufficient enough, you can't get a proper orientation, therefore you can't make the proper decision to take the appropriate action. So what happens, the result's not too surprising. People who had to face that, all of a sudden, they said, these people ended up coming out of nowhere, they're being marched off as prisoners, they're totally confused, and they can't figure out even what hit them. Game's over. We even see some of those accounts in Vietnam, the guys holding positions, all of a sudden these guys are in behind them and can't figure out where they came from and cause all kinds of panic and chaos. It's infiltration. So it's a very different kind of thing. The key thing is by doing it, you're really, in a sense, screwing up a superman. He doesn't get good observations. The orientation is screwed up, the decisions are screwed up, his actions are screwed up. It's very difficult. So, we look at it, then what's the essence of the method? You're really trying to cloud and distort your statement to improve your mobility to avoid get focused effort. You're trying to penetrate his system. Trying to shatter it, and then, of course, mop up the disconnect to the degree. The intent is quite simple. Use tactical dispersion in a focused way to gain tactical success and expand into grand tactical and hopefully strategic, which they didn't get in the comment in a minute. Now think about Napoleon. What did he do? He used strategic to gain grand tactical and tactical. That was one of the options. Tactical to gain grand tactical and strategic. Interesting. Plus Napoleon, what else did he have? He has strategic dispersion followed by a tactical concentration. Here you have tactical dispersion with strategic focus. So you have two inversions. Why did you have them? Very simple. Fire. They had to change. They were blowing their people. They had forced the people. Validity of modern weapons. Worthless. So the implication is quite simple. Small units exploiting tactical dispersion, rather than large formations dividing by the principle of concentration. Remember, Napoleon's strategic dispersion followed by tactical concentration. Now you got tactical dispersion with strategic focus or concentration. Just the opposite. By doing that, then you pump up his direction, paralyze him, bring down his system. So it raises an interesting question. Are they rejection of Napoleonic methods, the infiltration methods, or are they applications methods that are possibly different guns? And of course, the mere fact that I would put that thing after the double dash, I'm suggesting their application under different guns. Now we can also go back on this chart, we'll answer that 19th century question we haven't answered before. So if you look at these infiltration fire movement schemes, you can think of them as Napoleon's multi-thrust strategic penetration maneuvers. Remember, he had his units separate divisions pouring to a strategic level. Now we're doing it all the way down to squad level. So all of these fine and green, Napoleon's strategic maneuvers down to squad level in order to penetrate a guy's system. And until the rise of infiltration tactics used to tank by the Allies, Now, the 19th century and early 20th century commanders were able to evolve effective penetration maneuvers. You don't penetrate the other guy's system, why should he throw the towel in? Physically, mentally, we're going to get that later on. You can't penetrate normal mental or physical stability, why should he quit? He won't. He shouldn't. I wouldn't. And if he starts getting inside his mind, system, things start going to hell, his confidence starts going south. So now, why? Now we answer. Remember, we went back to that question we answered in the 19th century. Why were the 19th century, 20th century commanders unable to evolve effective penetration? The aristocratic tradition, the top-down command and control system, slaves addiction, the principle of concentration, the drill regulation mindset. You put them all together, what are they? They're obsession for control. What it is, obsession for control by high-level superiors over low-level subordinates. When you do that, you start restricting imagination, initiative, and adaptability. If you do that, now you can't evolve into new methods because you got all those constraints upon you. You see it, you go back and read the accounts, you say, God, why didn't these guys change? It didn't blow away. And all they're worrying about is whether they're going to make the line this way or the column this way. And I mean, you talk about the little teeny changes, and they're making something dramatic. They had to do something totally different. They couldn't see it. You people eventually did. I might add, even after World War I, we hadn't seen it. The Germans, it took us a while. Why? Some people still don't see it. Because they want to, so I got to control those people. You got them all slithering through a different direction. How do I control them?
Why did we end up winning World War I? Germans were better at this. Why did we win World War
No, I said they succeeded. The tactical and grand tactical never succeeded at the strategic level. Remember I said it earlier. The methods were good, but they also didn't apply them entirely correctly. We'll get in that. I'm not up to that chart. That's a good question. I want to bring in a couple other points, but this is very important. Also, the Germans, remember I said, we used the tanks. They didn't use it for World War I. That helped us a lot, too. They didn't think, like, just because they got the infiltration tactics right doesn't mean they got a lot of other things right. But I want to bring that point home because we've had trouble being able to adapt down to lower level. And it's not that easy. There's some other things that can get in the way. We have to get some other information. But now, to try to get at your question. Okay, the infiltration tactics, they did succeed down to lower level, but they coupled with ultimate failure to core and army level. The question is, why did that occur? One, Ludendorff violated his own concept because what he started doing, he laid out his plan. When they got hung up, he wanted to go the same direction, start feeding failure rather than success. Wasn't able to adapt. Now, that's sort of a harsh statement. I'm going to soften it in just a minute. There's some comments that have to be laid in there. Another one, exhaustion of combat teams leading the assault. After they went forward, they didn't replace those teams. They got tired out and the assault withered away. Nowadays, what you do is when you have an assault go in like that, when you're doing that, when one goes so far, then you start rotating the reserves to be the pointing back and forth, so you can keep the momentum of the operation going. And then here's another important one. Logistics were too inflexible to support that fluid penetration. We didn't have that gasoline engine at that time. Plus, those battlefields were all torn up. It was hard to move forward. In other words, to support that, like exploit those penetrations, or even bring up the artillery when they did need it. And the fourth one's a very key point. Communication were too remote to allow command to quickly identify and reinforce. Let me pinch in on that point. Let's pretend you're a front commander and you do want to use these infiltration tactics where you're going to exploit your adversary's vulnerabilities and weaknesses. Well, first of all, you got to know where they are. Have some feeling where they are so you can do that. Okay, the people who are succeeding know that. Some are going to get hung up, some are going to succeed. You want to feed success, not failure. But then they're going to have to transmit those instructions back to the higher level commanders so he can go through. Well, they didn't have the communication, they can do that too well. If he's got to allocate the forces, he has to know where it is. If he doesn't know, then he can start pumping forces up the blind alleys or police office. In other words, you have to have a good bottom-up communication system so the commander at the top side can reallocate or allocate correctly. He controls the follow-on forces and the reserves He depends upon his decision how they're going to be allocated or where they're going to be allocated. When. And then finally, the elastic defense. Now, it was initially developed by the Germans. Excuse me, the idea was initially French, but it was developed by the Germans and borrowed by the French by the time. Taking the fourth drive. The basic idea, rather than trying to defend the terrain, use the terrain as a medium for maneuver. Another term. And so you bend before the assault, move back before the assault, drag the German infantry out around their artillery, pour your artillery in, and then locally close them off from the flanks and the rear. Remember, I said terrain doesn't fight war, the machines don't fight war, the people don't use their mind. So we get this thing where we always have to defend every foot of the terrain. So the terrain doesn't fight. Use the terrain as a medium for maneuver in order to take out the force. Makes no difference if you're going forward or backwards, as long as you have the initiative and you're realizing your purpose against your adversary. So we see these kinds of things. Plus, the U.S. also entered the war. That's one of the reasons why the Germans want to get that drive going before we get over there and bring our force to bear. Okay? Now let's look at Guerrilla. Lawrence. He recognized how important support of the population was. Like modern guerrillas. In other words, the mediums which you operate in plus you disguise your own activity. Note this. I use these quotes. Get inside their mind. That's straight from Lawrence. You don't see that often. I saw it. Well, that's the very thing I'm talking about. Get inside their mind. Okay, quote. Another thing. Note this. Be an idea or thing. Drifting about like a gas. That's even more delicate than water. Because it brings out the idea not only of fluidity, but being invisible, inconspicuous, or indistinct. I can't get an image of what you're up to. And then attacking in depth. So in other words, you're doing different areas too. Well, you think about this kind of thing and combine it with attacking should be tip and run, not pushes with strokes. You're in and out, going in every direction on your adversary. Use of the smallest force, the quickest time, the furthest play. Well, think about that. If you're doing all these kinds of things, it's like the Mongols. Pretty soon you seem to be everywhere, yet nowhere. They don't know how to cope with it. And his strategy was very simple. War of attack. His basic strategy turned to war of attack. When he really tried to do his strategy was to pin the Turks down along the Hejaz Railroad between Medina and Damascus. The reason why he wanted to pin them down, he wanted to get them to bring in more troops and more supplies to suck up their effort there, because he was a chain for Allenby's cheese, which was a stroke into Palestine. In other words, to free up the resistance against Allenby. In other words, he was holding them by the nose, so Allenby had lesser resistance elsewhere. In this sense, the guerrillas were chains. And you think of the same thing. Remember what I said about Grant? Grant, in the final drive, remember, he was holding Lee up near Richmond while Sherman was cascading through the south. So Lee couldn't come to the city. He backed off, we would have got Richmond. Strategic change. So these things are played. Hang off one way in order to stroke in another direction. And note this. Never on the defense except on accident and error. Here's where many military men make that mistake. They think they're on the defense because they're moving backward. Let me preempt myself here. Mao said there were three phases to a guerrilla campaign. Strategic withdrawal, strategic equilibrium, and strategic offense. But they were all tactical offense, tactical offense, tactical offense. Because what the guerrillas understood, terrain doesn't wage wars, machines don't wage wars, people do it, they use their mind. So his way of depicting whether you're on offense or defense, do I or do I not have the initiative? If I've got the initiative, it makes no difference whether I'm moving forward, backward, or in any direction. I'm the offense. The initiative. Key word. Now we have a principle of war called the offense. You know, the British tried that at the Somme and they blew away 60,000 guys in one day. Now they're starting to modify. I noticed lately the Army came out with the principle of initiative instead of offense. That's correct. Although I tend not to like the principle of war, but nevertheless, going in the right direction. The idea of initiative. Because the guerrillas do understand. Rain doesn't play for it. People do use their mind. So initiative is tied to people. Do I or do not have it? How do I know when I got the initiative? We've got to something else. If I'm getting inside my adversary's OODA loop, I got the initiative. If he's getting inside my OODA loop, he's got the initiative. In other words, if I got him so fouled up that he can't make the appropriate decision or take the proper action, I'm getting initiative. Makes no difference what direction I'm moving in. So you can tie all these things together. And of course, the idea behind it, I'd put it a little differently, the actual words that Lawrence used was to extrude the Turks from Arabia. But the techniques that he was using was really just disintegrating even their ability to govern. So then, the impression when you look at this, and others, also arts and others, and also he was privy to the critique the German army conducted upon his government, in which they cited two ingredients they had to pay more attention to. One, we'll look at each one. First, the Soviet revolutionary strategy, then blitzkrieg, then guerrilla warfare. Let's look at